doing, man? I didn't see you. How you doing? All right, we're gonna get started. Um, I wanna I wanna first thank you all for coming out. I know traffic is heavy, and so we appreciate you all for coming out. My name is Dayvon Love. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And so myself and Lawrence Grandpre, who's our Director of Research, will be providing the primary lecture tonight about the publication that will release either late this month or early next month called Fear of a Black Planet. We'll talk about, that'll be primarily what we talk about this evening. I want to first thank the Reginald F. Lewis Museum for being a gracious host. This being a partnership with the Reginald F. Lewis to provide programming, educational programming to the community. So we're thankful for the Reginald F. Lewis for providing us space to do this here. For those who aren't familiar, I'm gonna just talk briefly about the work of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I know a lot of you may be familiar, but for those who are not, LBS is a grassroots think tank, explicitly, revolutionary, Pan-African nationalists in our perspective and worldview, unapologetic about advocating for the interests of people of African descent in Baltimore and around the state of Maryland. And so some of the work, much of our work is legislative advocacy. So if you've seen us, addressing issues like criminal justice, issues like the nonprofit industrial complex, and a variety of other issues that impact just all the different issues that impact Black folks. And so our primary work is legislative advocacy, but we also have been engaged in a variety of other projects, which include things like the Black Arts and Entertainment District on Pennsylvania Avenue. So anyone who's familiar with the historic cultural center that the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor was previously for Black creatives. And so that work that's led by our curator, Lady Breon, on the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor, to support Black creatives and change the ecosystem around Black arts city. Our work around cannabis legalization. So, for those who have been paying attention, cannabis legalization is a political inevitability in many of the states around the country. And we saw that very early on years ago. We were clear that it was important that if we're talking about repairing the harm done by the war on drugs, commandeering those resources to ensure those resources actually ended up going back to the community. So we were a part of helping to establish the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. 35% of the proceeds from recreational cannabis will go into a community repair and reinvestment fund. Each jurisdiction will get a percentage of that fund that'll be determined by that jurisdiction's contribution from 2002 to 2022, their contribution to the statewide cannabis possession charges, with the idea being that those jurisdictions that were disproportionately impacted will get a large percentage of the resources from the fund. And each jurisdiction was required to pass a law that determines how those proceeds are spent. And so what we did in Baltimore City was the establishment of the Baltimore Reinvestment and Reparations Commission. And this commission, its charge will be to distribute those resources that come from the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund to those communities impacted by the war on drugs. And so just wanted to mention that to give folks a sense of some of the work that Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle has been engaged in. One of the things that's been very crucial to the work that we've been doing is that as an organization, we're not a nonprofit, we're an LLC. It provides us a level of independence where we can be unapologetic in our advocacy. We're not limited in terms of the ability to call out directly elected officials that are in the way. Those elected officials that are the problem. We're able, because of the way that we're configured, able to be unapologetic in our advocacy. And we largely rely on the community to support us financially in order for us to maintain that level of independence so that we're not dependent on philanthropy. As many organizations that do good work happen to be dependent on philanthropy and it places limitations in terms of the kind of work they can do. So we're fortunate to be an organization in the landscape of advocacy that's able to maintain a high degree of independence and be able to say the things that unfortunately a lot of folks aren't able to say. I'll talk more about that aspect of our work later on. Before I jump into the particular talk about this publication, which you all, when you came in, there are a couple of reports, both the When Baltimore Awakes, which is something we produced back in October of 2019, and then our most recent report authored by Lawrence Grandpre, our director of research, around the decriminalization of drugs. Those two reports are a part of our, what we describe in our mission statement, our autonomous intellectual innovations. So because of our independence, there are certain kinds of intellectual arguments that we can make in certain industries and certain spaces that we think will create space for some of the kind of liberatory methodologies that are often marginalized in the mainstream. And again, I'll talk more about what that means, particularly in the context of violence prevention. But just wanted you all to avail yourself, if you have it, of those documents to give you a sense of the kind of publication that this will be, because with the Fear of a Black Planet will be similar to those two pieces that were made available at the table in the front. All right, we good? All right. So what we're going to do is Lawrence and I are going to talk for about 30 minutes, maybe 35 minutes total, and then we're just going to open it up, conversation and questions. All right, so that's the way we'll proceed. I'm going to talk about why we call the Fear of a Black Planet at the end, right? So for folks who are wondering that, I'm going to talk about that at the end. What I first want to do is just talk about basically what the publication will do. The conversations about public safety, violence, and crime are often not associated with movement activity. Oftentimes, social movements, when we talk about whether it's Black Lives Matter or other kinds of social movements, those things are often characterized as distinct from the efforts around addressing violence and public safety in our community. And one of the major arguments that we make is that, in fact, those two things are one and the same. That much of the work of addressing the system of racism and white supremacy, if we're not addressing that as it relates to the issue of violence in our community, then we will not have the appropriate tools and be able to create the appropriate interventions necessary to address the violence that we see in our community. And oftentimes when conversations about criminal justice reform emerge, often it's characterized as being at odds with addressing the issue of public safety, right? Again, I'll talk more about the specific discussions in Baltimore about that. What I start the piece with is a quote from a brother named Kelly Miller. Kelly Miller was the first Black person to attend Johns Hopkins University. He didn't finish, he eventually became, at one point, the chair of the American Negro Academy, which is one of the earliest intellectual communities created for and by Black people in the United States. In a book he wrote in 1908 called Race Adjustments, a collection of essays. And in that, I quote him discussing a conversation that was being had at the turn of the century. In that conversation, he actually refers to a book that was written by a brother. He didn't say his name, and I think as I'd explain what the quote is, it'll become obvious why he didn't. But he talks about a Black author during the turn of the century who wrote a book. And the purpose of the book was to make the argument that emancipation actually led to a crime wave that was bad for the community. And therefore, so what he does with this, what the author does that he's referencing, he gives statistics where he says that in the North, right, which is the place where Black people are supposed to be more free than the South, he says that there are a higher number of Black people per capita who are engaged in criminality, who are incarcerated, right, whereas there are lesser number per capita in the South. What Kelly Miller does is that he basically refutes the argument made by this author that he's referencing. And there are a few things that he does to refute it. The first thing he says is that when you look at the data comparing the North to the South being a much more agricultural economy, right, and agriculture in terms of civic life, that a lot of the way that people dealt with, theft or any kinds of violence was much more vigilante. Right. So the fact that there were more people incarcerated in the North, it's just a matter of institutional circumstance. Right. But without that analysis, this Black author that he's referring to would just be able to make this argument that there's more criminality based on that data. So what he does is he debunks that. What he also says in this quote, and it's a pretty extensive quote in the piece. The other thing that Kelly Miller says is that in terms of the crime wave that he's describing, that he says that, or the crime wave that he's refuting, rather, he says that the numbers for incarceration for white Northerners is higher than that for Southern Northerners. So his argument is that the conditions, if you just take a population, right, in a particular social class, regardless of race, and put them there, the same sociological forces are going to prevail, right? In other words, if you take a people with a similar socioeconomic condition, right, then you're going to get similar kinds of outcomes. And its argument is that Black people occupy, given the obvious condition of Black people, a larger concentration of folks that are in poverty, folks that have, instability in terms of the ability to fend for themselves. So the argument that Kelly Miller makes is that Black people constituting a higher level of a lower socioeconomic class also contributes to the fact that Black people would be more proportionally absorbed in and represented in incarceration and criminal justice system, right? I start with this quote because what this is an example of, we're talking the turn of the century, right? And so what this is an example of is the way that the issue of crime and violence was politicized for political purposes. And in that context, there were people who were advocating that the newly free, people of African descent, and that our freedom actually was something that was negative for the larger body politic of the United States. So there was a clear white supremacist political agenda using numbers, data around crime and violence to advance that perspective. So I quote that, and what I say, so I'm going to read an excerpt from it that kind of gives a sense of, what we're looking to do with this publication. The issue of violence and crime in Baltimore has been politicized in a way that serves as a proxy for political contestation around issues like gentrification, public sector spending, civil rights protections, Black political representation, and many other areas of public policy. The politicization of crime and violence is weaponized in political contexts that are deeply implicated by issues of race, and as a result, inhibit the ability for the development of policies that substantively deal with these issues. This paper will provide commentary that is aimed towards reimagining public safety and criminal justice in a way that can meaningfully address the recurring and systemic issues of violence, crime, and safety. Right. So I start with the Kelly Miller quote to say that similar to what Kelly Miller was doing at the turn of the century, this is similar in terms of what we hope to do, which is the way that violence has been weaponized in many ways as a political battering ram against people of African descent. We hope that this paper provides a similar intellectual refutation of those that will use it to undermine our quality of life as a people. So there are 5 sections. So what I'm going to do is going to talk about each section, summarize it, and then we'll go on to the discussion. So the first section is an overview of white supremacy, Black mythology, and dehumanization of violence. So it's really important, I think, for people to understand the way that societal propaganda of racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness are deeply seared into the collective American consciousness and the impact it has on a policy level. So I want to give 2 examples of that. The first is that one of the things that we talk about is when you look at the way that historians, traditional historians, will talk about and document Nat Turner's rebellion. Often when you read the news reports, one of the things we read some of the news reports that covered Nat Turner's rebellion, and to describe those engaged in the rebellion as deranged, bloodthirsty, pathological, right? And one of the things that, if you think about it in the context of America and the American Revolution, so the same kinds of violence that was necessary for the American Revolution is similar to what we should describe when we talk about Nat Turner's rebellion. Now, that's not something that's a commonly held understanding, right? But that should be how we understand Nat Turner's rebellion. But again, those at the time characterized it as some derangement, right? The idea of Black people taking the mark of our freedom is understood as deranged or pathological. This is the historical narrative. Now, the way that this impacts how we think about violence in our contemporary context is that those narratives make it difficult for people to think rationally about legitimate forms of violence that Black people may engage in, both as individuals and as a people. One of the things, and this is something that we delve deeper into in section 3. But for instance, when you think about a community, a person that lives in a community where there is violence, and they decide to carry a weapon, right? Not because they're interested in, creating violence, but because they want to protect themselves. Oftentimes, that individual, in terms of the politics, the policies, and the criminal justice system, is treated the same as a person who is interested in wreaking havoc in our community, right? So the policies don't make that distinction. But going back to that Turner piece and the narrative that it creates, that in many public spaces, and particularly in policy discourses, even mentioning the notion that there are legitimate contexts where violence, for Black people use violence being necessary, is something that is demonized, right? And so while it may seem academic, the distinction between the way Nat Turner's rebellion and the American Revolution, it actually plays a role in our ability to see Black people as human beings engaged in a rational activity of the capacity to defend yourself, right? So that's one example. And again, that has deep policy implications that I'm going to come back to in section 3. The second example that I'll give, this is the way in which we internalize those narratives. Harriet Washington, in her book Medical Apartheid, she does a section where she talks about the term crack baby, right? So if you think about the 80s and 90s, crack baby was one of those terms, along with like the welfare queen. These were terms that were used as the societal context to launch the war on drugs, to say that people of African descent are inherently criminal, pathological, etc. And so what she ultimately says in the piece is, in fact, and the idea being that children born to crack addicted mothers have an inherent propensity for crime and violence. But what is actually the case is that crack baby, there's no such medical term as crack baby, right? There's no medical basis for it. There's nothing particularly about crack cocaine that leads to any particular deformities that would not be the case for alcohol or any other kind of drug. So crack baby is a pop culture term, not a scientific medical term. But for many of us that were around or were children in the 80s and 90s, remember people calling each other crack babies to make fun of each other, right? Or that term just being used to characterize inner urban Black folks, crack baby, right? So that term is a term that was used as a part of the policy agenda, right? That many of us internalized, even though there was no medical basis for it, right? So again, section 1 is to frame that context in terms of the way in which notions of Black pathology are seared into our collective consciousness and will impact, as I talk about in section 3, the way that policy is crafted in that regard. Section 2, the sociology of violence and crime. And so part of what we do in section 2 is we look at the way that the policies around addressing crime actually have certain political agendas underneath it. So what I actually do is that we quote pretty extensively Michelle Alexander, her book Jim Crow, where she talks about how many of the civil rights era anti-civil rights politicians were also the primary progenitors of tough on crime policies, right? And many of them during that time, particularly in the 50s and 60s, during the height of those social movements, that, and I'm sure many of you may remember or know about the rhetoric around law and order, right? And so the idea of law and order was a part of the conservative agenda in terms of promoting these tough on crime policies. Now, without the historical context, one would think that, oh, these policies were about addressing crime in the community. But in fact, when you look at those, political leaders that were pushing for these tough on crime policies, what you find is that, in fact, the same people pushing those policies are the same people that are pushing against affirmative action, funding for public education, investment in social programs. They're the same people, right? And so then we have to then call into question, well, are the people that are the authors of those policies actually interested in improving the quality of life of Black people? Typically, their record as in terms of policy is that they are not, right? So that's section 2. Section 3, policy debates around crime and violence in Baltimore. So this is where, in the paper, we actually talk pretty extensively both about our policy fights on this question, LBS and other partners' policy fights on these questions, and some of the ways in which the things that I talked about in the first 2 sections impacted those debates. So I'm going to give a few examples of that I give in the paper. The first is that when you think back to, it was around 2017, 2018, there's a gentleman named Bobby Zirkin who used to represent the 10th Legislative District in Baltimore County, who used to be the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. And so as the murder rate went up in Baltimore City, him being the chair of that committee, convened a series of hearings in the summer of 2017 in preparation for a crime bill that would be put forward in 2018. The primary mechanism, the primary policy that constituted this crime bill were sentence enhancements. So the idea being that if you and it's and now I'm about to get into the weeds a bit, but I think this is important in understanding just how the policies, on one hand, in the public seem like they're addressing crime, but the mechanics of how they really work. So sentence enhancements. The idea is that if a person who engaged in a violent crime and has a firearm on them, there's already a 5-year mandatory minimum, right at the time. The idea you increase it to 10. The idea being that that would make it so that if they catch a person who had a gun in commission of a violent crime, maybe that person in that instance wasn't engaged in violence, but that would get someone who was prone to violence, therefore putting them away, making the community safer. So that's the logic behind the crime bill that was constituted. Now, there are a few things wrong with this idea. The first, National Institutes for Justice in 2016 put out a report that said that the greatest deterrence to someone engaged in crime is not the length of the sentence, but it is the likelihood that they'll get caught, right? That's extremely important because that's not something that is put out to the general public, right? And without explanation, the idea of enhancing a sentence being a deterrent, if you don't have the data in front of you, it'd be easy for one to just believe that that would be a deterrent to crime, right? But it is not. What it does, and this is the important piece. Now, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of putting Nat Turner and Nat Turner's rebellion in its appropriate context. What this does, when you enhance sentences, particularly for handgun-related charges, what you do is that a person in a community who has a handgun for protection, right? And this is to say that like I'm endorsing people just having illegal guns, right? But it's a rational decision for someone who lives in a violent community to have a firearm for protection. If you're a person who you're engaged in a cash industry, maybe you're engaged in an industry where you actually have to carry large sums of cash. Having a firearm on you is a rational decision. What sentence enhancement does is that it makes that person in the eyes of the law the same as the person who is a driver of violence in the community, right? So what sentence enhancements actually do is that they make it so that those who, again, may possess a firearm for protection are just as likely to have an enhanced sentence as those who are the folks that should be out of the community, right? And that's important because when we study the impacts of the criminal justice system, we see that a big part of the damage that is to be repaired are those that were sucked into the criminal justice system who would have been better served outside of it, right? Additionally, one of the policies that was put forward is a policy around limiting the discretion of judges. So the idea being that the police catch you have a gun, the judge should not have discretion to look at your case and make a determination, right? The idea being that judges are letting people off too easy. But the challenge there is that if you have a person who, again, a person that's not interested in pillaging the community, I just have a firearm for protection. A judge can, in that case, make that assessment and say you don't belong, behind bars for a long period of time. We're going to put you in another situation, right? The other piece to this is also important, is that these sentence enhancements are workarounds that are rooted in the incompetence of law enforcement, right? And here's what I mean by that. And I've been in conversations with representatives of prosecutors and prosecutors themselves. And one of the questions that I ask them is like, if you're serious about addressing violence, it doesn't seem that you need more penalties to go after people. There are plenty of penalties on the books. In fact, and I'll tell a quick aside story that also helps to make the point I'm about to make. In 2017, the then mayor, Catherine Pugh, and City Council President Jack Young were putting forward a bill that would say that if you have a firearm anywhere in public, a mandatory 1-year minimum sentence. Now, of course, we fought it. And what ended up happening was the bill was amended in committee that it would be that possession of a firearm and commission of a violent crime, an automatic 1-year mandatory minimum. And the bill passed. Two things that's interesting about that. The first is I don't know that the city council actually has the authority legally to make policy on that question. But even more interesting is that there was already a 5-year mandatory minimum on the books. So in many ways, they were going in the opposite direction of what they were trying to do, right? This goes into what, in many respects, these policies not being effective are more of a dog whistle than an attempt at effective policy, right? So what I've said to representatives of prosecutors and their advocates is to say, you already have all the penalties on the books you need, charged for manslaughter, murder, and get a prosecution. Right? Now, what they won't say is that the reason that they are not doing that is because they can't get good cases from law enforcement to prosecute those. Now, if they were to say that, they would have to admit the incompetence and corruption of law enforcement. Additionally, one of the things that we've also worked for is police accountability legislation, right? And one of the things that we've been primarily advocating for is community oversight of law enforcement. Again, sometimes people make these things separate. The state of Maryland, they commission on restoring trust in policing. They issued a report. And in their report, they cited 2 studies that were done, one by Morgan State Institute of Urban Research, one by Johns Hopkins, where they both said that the majority of the community does not, even people who generally have neutral or positive ideas about law enforcement, do not trust police, who themselves have said that they've seen law enforcement engage in activity they thought was detrimental to the community, right? But what the report also said is that community members would be more willing to work with law enforcement to address issues of homicide if they were involved in oversight of law enforcement. Community oversight of law enforcement has been something that the legislature has been the most steady against. That community oversight of law enforcement essentially would be the ultimate ceding of power from law enforcement into the hands of the community, right? But if we're talking about public safety, and you talk to people who are in law enforcement, in order to get those that are responsible for murders, you have to be able to collaborate with folks in the community to be able to get a case. But the community will not collaborate with law enforcement, again, given its incompetence and corruption. So when the conversation around sense enhancements, as I mentioned earlier, was really more a dog whistle, we actually quote a study, a communication scholar, that says that policies and laws, they did a poll, and they said that policies and laws that appear to negatively impact Black people more than others are more likely to get support in terms of those policies, right? So that's important to note, because what I'm clear about is that these sense enhancements, the purpose of them was not to address crime. The purpose of them was to dog whistle to a particular constituency that has deeply pathological anti-Black notions of Black people that don't care about making the distinction between the person who has a gun for protection and the person that's actually the driver of violence. For them, that person that just happens to be carrying a firearm for protection is collateral damage, and they don't care about that collateral damage. And it is that collateral damage that really produces the problem that we see in terms of the criminal justice system and its negative impact that it's had on Black people. The last thing I'll say about what we talk about in that section is that what that also does is that when it comes to policies, specifically regarding, one of the things we worked on was, I mentioned the cannabis legalization piece. And one of the controversial pieces of legislation, particularly our partners with the ACLU of Maryland, worked on the idea of banning the sole use of odor, the smell of marijuana, as the basis for stop and search, right? Because oftentimes we want to decrease the amount of interaction you have with law enforcement, right? And the use of odor, and I'm sure there are people that have even personal experiences of a police officer saying they smell the odor of cannabis, allowing them to essentially search you, right, and abuse your right. And that was actually an extremely controversial and hard bill to pass, even though recreational cannabis is about to be legalized. And when we looked at and observed the testimony of prosecutors, they saw the odor of cannabis as an important tool to address crime, right? Again, if we think about the war on drugs and the societal propaganda, right? I'm sure many of you know about the Ehrlichman quote, the person who used to work for Richard Nixon, who said that a part of the Southern strategy, right, associate, marijuana with Black people, right, and crime, right? And so similarly, that's the way that policy has been rolled out. So for them, when you talk to and observe the testimony of prosecutors, they really saw like this piece of legislation as something that would be a hindrance to their crime fighting strategy, right? Um, so again, this just goes to show again, this is more about dog whistle, right? And when you think about the constituencies that are more likely to support that kind of policy, those are constituencies that, again, carry very deeply anti-Black notions around people of African descent that are highly based in pathology. So that's section 3. Section 4, anti-Blackness, love, self-concept, and self-knowledge as the framework for anti-violence work. And what I want to do first is shout out Baltimore Brothers CBRS movement. I see some of you brothers at the front. These are folks that really are on the front lines in terms of addressing violence in our community. If you talk to any of them and their colleagues about the work they do in the community, what's central about it is the love, it's the genuine, authentic love they have for the community that they're serving. And anybody who moves in the context that they move in, one of the difference between how they're able to move and how some of the more, and Lawrence is going to talk more about some of the limitations of the public health perspective, but some of those more professionalized, nonprofit adjacent folks, right, that do anti-violence work, and I think many of them well-meaning, the difference between how they're able to move and how these brothers are able to move is that there's a way in which the community can sense the deep love and respect they have for them, right, the deep respect for their humanity that is a part of their socialization. That many people in mainstream society were socialized to see Black people as inherently inferior, right? See Black people as needing some outside intervention in order to address our condition, right? That is the assumptive logic of much of the professionalized approaches to dealing with violence in our community. And it's actually astonishing. One of the things we quote, I'm paraphrasing from Amos Wilson's book, Black on Black Violence, where he describes the phenomenon of violence in cities across the country amongst Black people as an externalization of a suicidal impulse. And when you think about the way in which the societal propaganda around representations of inherent criminality and inferiority, that it makes it easy for a young Black person to kill another one, right? That in many ways, the homicide and the issue of suicide are flip sides of the same coin, right? Given the nature of the propaganda that this society has saturated us in, right? And so in many ways, when we look at the behaviors that we see in our community, and we think about the importance of understanding the system of racism and white supremacy as a part of what perpetuates that phenomenon, then we see that if we're serious about addressing the issue of violence, then we have to center it on the issue of addressing the lack of self-knowledge and love that many of our young people have for themselves. That's not something that you hear either from law enforcement or from many of the major institutions that have been tasked with dealing with violence, right? And so what I'm gonna do now is ask Lawrence to come up. Lawrence, he actually is gonna craft a very particular part of the piece that looks at the limitations of the public health approach to violence prevention. And then what I'm gonna do when he's done, finish up with just talking more in depth about the methodology and alternatives that really should get invested in as a way to deal with the issue of violence.
Good evening, everybody. You hearing me good?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm gonna try to go quick because I know we got a lot to talk about and we're gonna leave time for Q&A. So I started really thinking about this maybe like 7 years ago. I remember people, Andy was one of them, brought to us an example of, Safe Streets has been around, violence mediation, conflict happening in community. They claim to use a public health model to prevent the spread of violence. And there were actually some tales that some cops, they found drugs in one of the Safe Street offices. And the rumor, I'm not sure we've had 100% collaboration, but many people like to believe it, is that one of the officers associated with the gun trace task force was part of the people who were planting those drugs. To discredit Safe Streets, who uses people who are formerly in street organizations to mediate these conflicts. So the idea behind that is that obviously, at least how I conceived it at the time, and unfortunately I had to change my mind a little bit, we'll talk about why, is that if things like Safe Streets work, we don't value as much money to cops anymore. And that should be the reality, right? But if you look at this is not a critique of anyone doing any of the hardest work that one can do, mediating violence in the street. This is a critique of the political economy, which many of those folks are forced to operate, and the psychological, social phenomenon that codes anti-Blackness into the work those folks have to do to get money and survive, right? So with that said, let's do a brief overview on the argument around when they say public health approach to violence. That's what people say. Don't fund the police, fund public health approach to violence. But we need to break that down to understand the limitations of that argument. So here's what they say in general. Like, if it's not your grandfather's public health, we know about Tuskegee, we're sorry, we're different now, right? We say that, and this is again me mimicking what the public health establishment would say. They didn't think about social determinants of health like poverty. They were too focused on, top-down, quantifiable things. And so we're going to apply the skills of epidemiology. They call it epidemiological criminology, which is a $5 word for just saying, think about crime as a disease. They say violence is a disease, and that we have the cure. We being largely institutions like University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, elite academic institutions. And here are some of the parts of that so-called cure are violence mediation, mediating conflicts in the street. That's one part of it. But they also talk about changing community norms. So if the communities have normalized violence as a response to their conditions, we have to do things like have a lot of T-shirts and very visual things to change those norms in the community, right? Additionally, they talk about providing mental health services, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, to change people's psychological relationship to violence to prevent it from being the trigger, right? So on face, it's hard to view any of those things in particular as inherently evil or bad. When you approach it from the larger question about, I'll just keep it as simple as possible. I have a hard time learning nonviolence from Johns Hopkins University, from the American public health establishment, from a for-profit public health establishment. At a very basic level, it wasn't until they used the words public health and academic institutions began to see there was money involved in it, that money started to flow. We know that Black folks have been doing forms of violence mediation in our communities forever, but specifically since the Northern Migration. When we saw that urban violence in growing cities in America was a problem, we've been doing vernacular community forms of violence intervention that have not only not been invested in, but have been sometimes, I fear, been pathologized by the way in which public health has been talked about. So I'm just going to read one quote, and I think many people in this room will understand this argument, but I want to make it very clear, because I think it's going to make the link I'm going to make next very clear also, is that it's not that public health hasn't thought about class, which is the typical argument. It is that it has a very intentional relationship to keeping class conditions as they are. And the institutions of public health, especially globally, are fundamentally built around this assumption. So here's a quote from Warskin and Gesso Aguilera in 2017. The rise of international trade during the 20th century, concerns about infectious disease and detrimental trade and an expanding reach of capitalist enterprise became a motivation for international cooperation on public health. During the 70s, the World Health Organization prioritized improving the distribution of health services. This horizontal vision of public health policy gained substantial support worldwide. However, during the 80s, WHO entered a chronic financial crisis, produced largely because of the frail financing of the UN. Reagan administration withheld large portions of annual dues. The pendulum swung back from the horizontal orientation to the preferred vertical interventions. The orientation emerged largely from the efforts of the World Bank and affiliated international financial institutions, as well as key private foundations. Again, attention turned to vaccines and medicine as technological solutions to health problems in the global south. This orientation further facilitated the financial operation of multinational corporations in these countries. The report of the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health emphasized improving the health and longevity of the poor is a fundamental goal of economic development. Reducing AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria would increase workforce productivity and facilitate investments. A policy emphasis on quote-unquote investing in health conveyed a double meaning. Investing in health to improve health and productivity, and investing in capital as a route to private profit in the healthcare sector. As Jeffrey Sachs stated, what investor would invest his capital in a malarial country? So a lot there, but think about that tension between that like horizontal public health, which is like health services, and vertical public health. One of the things that's happening is that we're having a rhetorical slippage. A lot of people in the community will say treat it like a public health problem. But when we're talking about public health, we're talking about the health of the community, and we're talking about notions of disease that are more holistic than just what a vaccine or a pill can address. It's about poverty. It's about social alienation. It's about the psychological violence of dealing with racism. So when we talk about the disease of violence, many of us in the community are using a holistic conception of disease. But because people use the words public health, the public health establishment says, oh, great, there's broad support for public health interventions. Let me come in with my vertical conception of disease. And when it says, what investor would invest his capital in a malarial country? I mean, I think it's kind of, you see where I'm going. What investor would invest in Baltimore when it's plagued by the disease of violence? So it's pretty obvious that in terms of what Derek Bell will call interest convergence, it may not quite be the desire to keep Black people alive that's driving this new wave of public health approaches to violence. You can't gentrify the city if 350 bodies are dropping every year. So that's the reality, and they don't want to change the fundamental conditions of resource inequity, power distribution that creates that 350 number. They just want to get a little bit below 300, claim mission accomplished, and bring the capital in. Right? So that's the core of the argument, but I want to say something a bit beyond just the pure class economic analysis, kind of getting to what Dayvon's going to talk about in terms of culture and psychology. Because public health doesn't just have this role of like materially preserving class relations, it also reflects a culture, a Eurocentric culture, which oftentimes is used against more collectivist African-centered approaches to thinking about disease, violence, and violence prevention. So does anybody know the story of the Jon Snow? Not Game of Thrones Jon Snow. The so-called father of epidemiology, Jon Snow. So there was a cholera outbreak in London in the 19th century. A lot of people were using this the view of disease that like comes from the air. It's a miasma area of disease, like it's just the air. And he was like, no, I think it's the water. So he actually was like, it seems like I'm plotting the people who get sick, they all come from this pump. So I think we should cut the pump off, and they did, and it worked. So that is kind of seen as the moment where epidemiology became like a real science. And I think this story is really great because it's everything. You can't just look at history as objective. Cultures tell themselves stories to tell them who they are and who they should be. And the Jon Snow story is an excellent example of Eurocentric epistemology creating a hero that fits its vision of how it wants to relate to the world. Individual hero dealing with an ignorant establishment picks a strategic intervention that he can show with data. And not only does it work, it works and they don't have to spend any money or change anything. So everything about how the Jon Snow story is told, and again, this is the genesis of the new epidemiological approaches to violence, right? It's all framed through a Eurocentric narrative. In fact, the so-called father of the epidemiological theory of violence was studying tropical diseases in Africa before he came to Chicago. So this is distinct from African epistemologies, which view things such as circular time versus linear time, right? So circular time isn't just seeing time as cycles, stuff in the past can occur. It's about valuing the contributions to the past and seeing them as valuable to create a better future. While linear progressive notions of time are very much like if it came in the past, it was whack, we're always getting better, we're always improving, we can leave that stuff in the past behind. So these theories are important because they frame how to understand what is being used in many, not all, many of the dominant systems of violence prevention. We don't actually know, they don't publish their curriculum, it's a trade secret. But talking to people and understanding some of these cultural dynamics, we can see some of the ways in which they narrate violence potentially being problematic. So just think about it as I always ask this question. If violence in America is a disease, who's the typhoid Mary? Who's the patient zero? And I offer the example, at least in my conceptual, not my conceptual frame, the conceptual frame been given to me by certain folks in the Black radical tradition, violence prevention tradition, someone like Christopher Columbus. We now standing answer to that question in my theory of the world. But if this answer frames violence against Black people as injected oppression, Amos Wilson also says he sees violence between Black people as like a copycat serial killer. Looking at the violence that white people have done to Black people as the definition of humanity and masculinity. And seeing Black people to say, to get a piece of the pie, to protect my family, I have to do what they do. But if that is a theory that is used, it's not empirical, it does not isolate a germ or a particular quantifiable unit of violence they can see spreading. So it's not desirable within the Eurocentric epistemology. Also, if that's true, Hopkins can't teach that. They cannot monetize that. They can no longer be the center of gravity in the violence prevention space. Right. So wrapping up, something like cognitive behavioral therapy. You'll see some programs talk about life coaching, and cognitive behavioral therapy is a broad term, but it generally thinks about your thoughts, cognition, and rethinking how you think about your thoughts, which is like generally really good if you want to like think about quitting smoking or addiction. But to think that all violence is just a cognitive behavioral distortion ignores the political reality people face in these communities. Where I don't know if that brother, I don't want to kill that brother, but I don't know if he wants to kill me. So I have to keep a gun on me, not because I want to actively pursue him, but he needs to know I carry a gun, because that is a deterrent from him potentially attacking me. So it's almost, I use the frame of like international relations and like nuclear, mutually assured destruction. You don't have to like it, but the reality is, if other people have nukes, I can understand why another nation wants a nuclear weapon. And we grant nations that sovereign right to like have armies to deter from invasion. We don't give Black people the sovereign right to protect themselves in America, right? And I think that something like ROCA, which is the program I'm talking about, using cognitive behavioral distortions as the frame for violence, I fear it can become a form of almost like gaslighting, where it's like, I see my reality, I don't think I'm crazy, but you're telling me the fact that I'm even thinking about having violence is my personal fault for thinking that thought, not the structure for putting me in the position where I have to carry a gun or have to be on the corner to feed my family, keep the lights on, right? So finally, if you look at like, there is a YouTube video of Roca from Massachusetts, because Roca is not indigenous to Baltimore. And the lady in the video says, yeah, you know, we do life coaching, and sometimes they don't show up. And when they don't show up, I tell my friends in the police department, hey, if you see Johnny, you have a dime bag on him, pick him up, process him, bring him back to me. And again, that was stunning because many people still think public health approaches to violence are the opposite of policing. In that example, they are fundamentally connected to and dependent upon policing. And weed is actually legal in Massachusetts, so it's just really crazy. She would even say that, right? But that's what I mean. We have really well-meaning people, maybe some of the folks in this crowd, truly adopting the public health frame because they believe it deals with the pathologization of Blackness. And my fear is that could actually be a perfection and a furthering of that pathologization of Blackness, right? And we see some folks in the public, in the violence prevention space, really saying like, not everybody, but some of them are saying things like, look, this is not about defunding police. This is not about displacing police. It's about having something that works with policing, which is obviously what I want to see and many people in this room want to see. So we can't trust this valuable essential services just to public health, capital P, capital H, public health trademark establishment. We have to have the community rise up and demand more holistic interventions that think about the health of the community, not just traditional public health, right? So that's my spiel. I'm going to turn it back over to Dayvon.
I want to reiterate a particular point that he makes that I think is central, which is that there is a political economy to violence prevention in this current moment. There are people, as we've talked about, the nonprofit industrial complex, the people that profiteer off of Black people suffering, and there are major institutions that now see violence prevention as a major revenue source. And if people were to adopt the approach to violence prevention that we have described, then that means that Hopkins can't do it, right? That means that those institutions, those mainstream institutions, will not be able to be authors of things. So an example, like one of the projects that we're a part of, the Baltimore Rites of Passage Initiative. So Rites of Passage, there's a history of it in Baltimore around the United States. African Center Rights, the idea of taking young people through a process that takes them from childhood to adulthood and providing them the tools they need in navigating the world and identity formation that's necessary for effective socialization. And
African Center Rites of Passage programs are things that, again, we have to do. People of African descent would have to do, and the resources would have to go to those formations that we control and operate. I mentioned, and again, they're represented here in the front, brothers from We Are Us, right? That if they became the ones that drive Baltimore City's agenda for violence prevention, right? That means that the resources would go there, right? And that these other institutions, and again, this is the way that the notion of anti-Blackness often is framed, right? Where Black people are understood and our institutions are understood as needing outside validation in order for them to be legitimate, in order for them to have the kind of intellectual veracity to be legitimate. And we say that, in fact, these institutions have demonstrated themselves to be an abysmal failure, right? Now, because of the status of those kinds of institutions, that's not a thought that would naturally cross a person's mind. But these are institutions that have been given billions upon billions of dollars to address these problems, and they have been deficient. Conversely, those of us in the community, right, who've been attempting to address this problem, who have not gotten the sufficient resources, but have been able to do things that have been impactful, those are the things that need to be studied, right? And so in this section of the report, I'll talk extensively about the examples that I just gave, about the work that's happening on the ground around violence prevention. And then the last section are just policy demands. And I'll go through them quickly. This isn't exhaustive. This is the part, one of the parts that we're doing the finishing touches on. But no sentence enhancements as a way to address violence. Community oversight of law enforcement. So again, I've talked about how sometimes those things are made separate and put in the police accountability space. But in fact, if law enforcement is to go after the people who are wreaking havoc in the community, they have to have a relationship with the community. That relationship has to be one where the power dynamic is flipped, where the community has control over the institution of law enforcement, to the extent that in our current system, we have to deal with law enforcement, right? Investments in community-based programs like, We Are Us, like African Center Rites of Passage, and directly addressing the business community that traditionally are the ones that often press government to engage in the kind of tough on crime policies that I mentioned. The reason why the piece is called Fear of a Black Planet, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the references, whether it's Public Enemy and their album Fear of a Black Planet, and they get that from Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, ISIS papers, Fear for Black Planet. The instruments of social control, right? Law enforcement, prisons, the instruments of social control were not designed to keep people safe. They were designed having in mind, when you think about the history of this country and white folks' anxieties around people of African descent. And there's a particular thing around notions of Black masculinity. Dr. Wilson refers to the anxieties around Black phallic potential, right? The ability for Black people to reproduce, and the inherent anxiety that white, and she argues that that's really what undergirds racism. And that you look at the history of lynching and the way that Black men's genitals were seen as trophies for white men, right? And you look at the fact that, slave catchers being the kind of institutional antecedent to law enforcement. And you think about prisons being primarily expanded after emancipation as a way of social control. That what we see today, when people talk about law enforcement and public safety, these people that talk about sentence enhancements and tough on crime policy, whether they know it or not, what underlies the policies that have put us in the condition that we're in is that fear of a Black planet, right? That's what undergirds it. And unfortunately, like when I go down to testify in Annapolis, I don't often, you get 2 minutes to testify. We're not invited to the briefing sessions that happen during session where you get more time to explain. But it's important to be clear that even the folks who get to testify, who are on our side of the issue, often when we talk about this undergirding piece around this fear of a Black planet that is evident in all aspects of civil society, this part of the discourse is often not included in discussions around safety, violence, and criminal justice. So for us, it was important, and using that name and that reference, to include that scholarly literature base that often isn't accessible to the mainstream into the discussion, because it is, from our perspective, it is the best explanation for these systems that configured against the humanity of people of Africa. So I'll stop there and we'll take any questions or thoughts that people have. So, Ed, should people take up the mic around, or people should just be loud?
Yeah, so actually,
Mhm.
it's a little bizarre, but this helps people on the video hear what you're saying. So it's also good to know who's talking at one time. So just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. So if you have any questions, let me know. All right.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, does the report explore the historical timeline of political decisions that led to the expansion of um, this, I guess, the prison institution, and thereafter all of the policies that led to continue to foster that institution?
So we do some of that. So part there are a few things relevant to your question that we do. The first is that we make it clear that the police and prison system in the United States is out of step with any system kind in the history of the world. If you look at other societies, right, other societies that were just as advanced and complex did not have the level of carceral mechanisms of control that this society has. So we make it a point to make that clear, right? That many people have internalized prisons and police as like a necessary part of a healthy society, and we make it clear that that's not the case. And then what we also do then is we take it from enslavement, right, in many ways as part of its underlying logic, being the kind of carceral social control perspective. And then what we do is we then go through different periods that are important in terms of policy around that. So we talk about, so I mentioned in the beginning, Kelly Miller and the critique of book that he references where they make the argument that emancipation led to the crime wave. We then look at like the civil rights movement, and we look at the ways in which both the Republican strategy that I mentioned, that I think most people at this point are aware of, but also looking at the alignment between those anti-civil rights forces, right, politically, and how they contributed to that, and how for them the expansion of prison actually was beneficial to a conservative right-wing political agenda. So what we do is we start with that, but then we look at these different periods of time, again, with the point being that none of this was about making people safer, right? And that's one of the things that we hope to demystify, that history helps us to do that.
Dayvon, there was a question on the live stream about Lawrence. Could you further explain the externalization of a suicidal impulse quote?
So I think we both can do that. But I'll say one thing that I think is important that someone who uses African descent scholars is to counteract societal anti-Black notion that they weren't rigorous and that you can test some of the assumptions. Because that quote, we've used that quote for years. So it was a cool thing to say. People remember it. But I heard something on NPR that was basically a scholar saying that if you map the ratios of homicide to suicide within white men to Black men, they're exact inversions of each other. So the white men have 3 suicides for every homicide. Black men have 3 homicides to every suicide. So it's one of those things when you start to see things like that, you can understand the actual empirical validation of some of the hypotheses given to us from our African-centered elders. And yeah, I mean, if you want to talk more about that,
That's good.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much. I'm interested in the leaders of the beautiful struggle. Your, I don't know if take is the right word to use, on this newly formed accountability, community accountability for police. So you're aware of it. A friend of mine is one of the members on this panel of 5. That my understanding from what he has shared with us is that any complaint that's made against, this would be in the city, Baltimore policeman, they review it. They recommend or they determine what kind of discipline is to happen to that police officer. The police commissioner cannot override their recommendation or their discipline. He can increase it, but he can't ignore it or decrease it. So, and my understanding, it's brand new. I guess it was part of what was part of the legislature this year. And I understand it's not just in the city, it's in every, I guess, of the 24 districts in the state. So tell me what your take on this is. How do you feel this as a way of improving the community's take on police behavior?
So that was a part of the 2021 police accountability work that we've done. And I mentioned it a bunch when I acknowledge our partners from the ACLU of Maryland that are here that we work closely with, as well as many other partners on that. I mentioned before community oversight as the pinnacle of police accountability work. So you have some people talking about police training, body cameras. For us, community oversight is the most important because the biggest deterrent to abuses from police officers is the ability to impact their livelihood, right? And so the ability to investigate and engage in discipline. What the legislature did was so there's community oversight. What the legislature did was not, we argue it wasn't community oversight. We argue what it was community involvement in the internal police discipline process. Better than what they had, but not community oversight. What you're describing is the legislature's described, and it's overly complex. One of our criticisms of it. Each jurisdiction has to have a police accountability board, right? So this is a board that can take public complaints about law enforcement. It has no power to investigate independently a complaint, but what it does, it gets to hear complaints from community, and they are able to place folks on the administrative charging committee. The administrative charging committee, again, every jurisdiction has it. The charging committee is responsible that when any complaint comes to about an officer, it goes to a 5-member board. Again, the police accountability board. And what we did in Baltimore City was we allowed each council person to make a recommendation that would then serve on the police accountability board, because we didn't want it to be concentrated in the mayor, because the mayor also controls the police department, so diffusing some power. So the police accountability board gets to nominate both its chair and a designee to this 5-person board. So again, what they did, we described as like community involvement in their internal process. They're still having to rely on the police department's internal they call it the Police Integrity Bureau, it used to be called Internal Affairs, but still dependent on law enforcement's investigation of it. And it's not an independent body. That disciplinary process lives within the police department's framework, which again is better than what they did in the past, but not truly giving power to the community to both determine and shape discipline and investigation of law.
Brother Love, again, I'm so impressed. I had to get here because I need to know what I need to know, and you so brilliantly always put it together. You're like our young Baltimore own W.B. Du Bois and John Heinrich Clark all rolled up in one. So we'll be looking in textbooks saying, "Did you know him?" I'm so appreciative of you setting down the policy work that we need to do to attack institutionalized racism and white supremacy as it negatively impacts our lives as Black African folk. But what I want to discuss as an educator, 2 days ago, Baltimore City Public Schools ended its school year. And what I've been horrifically seen and touches me deeply is the violent behavior of our children, of our children's parents, of our educators towards children and their parents, violent language and even violent physical behavior. So, and I really want to have a conversation with the brilliant brothers up front who do the true grassroots work of how we as Black African people can learn to speak non-violently and deal with our own interracial conflict, from talking to a neighbor, which could lead to death when something is done, how African Black men and women speak to each other violently in front of their children, which causes their children to believe that they can speak like that to other adults, and our own issues of class and gender identity, the homophobic, vile, disgusting language that comes out of churches and comes out of our own community towards other Black African people who are LGBTQ+, disparagingly called now among our own culture as the alphabet people, which is the equivalent of a slur of the N-word. What can you three brilliant young brothers and the brothers up front who deal with it every day, what can we do? Are there some basic strategies that we can take out of here on when we're in conflict with one another, whether it's in our home, in our schools, our churches, walking down the street, someone bumping into you, someone parks too close to your car, that can lead to our death, how violently we have adapted that behavior. And thank you for sharing it, that we are practicing unhealthy psychological behaviors. How can we begin to do that in our personal life? Love ourselves, and then create the policy to keep racist supremacy, white supremacy from impacting us. What can we do with how we can lovingly uplift each other and hold each other accountable?
And so I want to put you on the spot. I would like one of y'all to speak to it in a moment if y'all would like. What I'll say first to what you said is two things. I will say the first is that I think the term trauma is something that's been like overused and like made a pop culture thing almost. When we talk about like people of African descent, there's a very particular kind of trauma that we have experienced as a people. And I think too often we've been kind of just muscling through it. And there are lots of kind of dysfunctional behaviors that are bound up in what has literally been our survival to just kind of get through it. There's a training that we actually did years ago, Warrior Healer Builder by the IA Institute in Atlanta, one of the best trainings I've ever taken. And what's so good about it is that it really helps for us to identify as people of African descent, like the particular ways in which our traumas impact, like how we relate to each other. It impacts like one of the best insights from it is that when we think about the dehumanization of people of African descent, one of the things that it does is that it encourages people that you can't feel good unless you're putting someone else down, right? And so we may see that in our everyday lives and just attribute it to like that's some interpersonal stuff. But in fact, when you think about the way in which white supremacy impacts our self-worth, right? The way that the thinking of putting someone else down to bring ourselves up, there's a way in which that advances the way that colonialism has injected in us notions of inferiority that cause us to see bringing other folks down, right, as a way for us to feel better about ourselves, just as one example. So I think there's a real comprehensive healing that we need as a community. Even those of us that see ourselves as highly functioning, right, and doing well, I think there's a collective healing that needs to be done in order to address that. Now, if one of y'all are interested in speaking, because the question around like what can people do in their day-to-day lives, so if there are things that y'all want to add to, what is it that you would advise, and introducing yourselves and advise people to do in that context. So anyone speak to that? Y'all had to know I was going.
Hey. One of the things that and the compliment that you gave to Dayvon, my former student, Adam, is right on point. And brother, thank you for putting in the work. But in terms of Andre, in terms of where we are, we have so many successful exceptions. And it's unfortunate there's successful exceptions. That, in other words, we go into places where people anticipate wrong and the right happens. And it happens over and over, it grows, but we don't replicate our successful exceptions. We don't duplicate those things in terms of our young people. And I'll just use a real example. So when they started to see those young people who have been forced out for 40 years to back poverty, didn't give up, that didn't decide not to eat food out the trash can, that didn't give up, when they decided that they wanted to have address that issue for their interests, but we were smart enough to know that there would be mutual interests in the process. We would demand it. Dayvon, Adam, that thought, that thinking came into the process. So here's what we know. When you're trying to create cultural competence and consciousness with our young people, and I just know it over time, former student of mine, anybody that cannot treat me right can't teach me right. It's a fundamental thing. Quality connected relationship. So once I get a relationship with you, it's unfortunate that pedophiles understand it. That's why with their most devilish instinct, they try first through a relationship. They know it. But for those of us who do it righteously, you build the relationship with them and then begin to have the cultural dialogue about where we are, what we are, all of the issues, gun peace, all of those things, bringing in individuals who we don't even have to have all of the conversation. We've had to have people who have life experience, bring them into the conversation because that's what happened. We know that even youngsters who go to prison, if there's a certain person in prison that have already done the work, that person can usher them into the prison process. Quality connected relationship everywhere. So I'm saying that's what I think has to happen. That we have to love our children because they already tell you, I feel you. They don't say, I hear you, I feel you. Energy is felt. And so that's it. We just got to do that, replicate that. We're starting to see our youngsters believe in us in terms of now not squeezing to get your money, but get your money over here. You deserve to get money, but you deserve also to get some other knowledge. You deserve it because they're just trying to survive. So that's what I think has to happen. You have built a quality connected relationship and then build out through what we know. And this is the thing that we also, we are, where we don't know, we have people who know. And it's all right to step back and yield to people who know what you don't know. Right? And you can get that to my kid, my youngster. If they believe in me, I'll say, give them a pass. Let them talk to you. They would say, let them talk to you, y'all. Okay. All right. What's up, y'all? Somebody got to usher you into the hearts. Whoever have already ushered themselves into the hearts of our children, if you don't know them, they can usher you into their heart.
Thanks, Doc.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to thank his brother Lawrence, right? Brother Dayvon and brother Adam. These brothers are powerful. Can we give them some love? Word is bond. Yeah. Personally, I have a lot going on. I knew I needed to be here because of that moment. And I want to just speak to what the brother said in regards to our young people. Stand up, Calvary. So he's one of our leaders, one of our graduates. Turn around so the people can see. And yeah. Come here real quick. Come here, Bilal. Turn around. I want them to see the shirts. And he mentioned Baltimore Brothers. We run our program is 5 years strong, and Family Lead funds us. Right, it's not a lot of money, but it's very helpful. We can't buy food with the money they give us. We can't use transportation. You can't use them funds, right? But I have to leaders of Beautiful Struggle. Dayvon and them made sure that we got the assistance we need. I want to say 2 years ago, just to keep the program running, right? Now, we pick our young men up. We bring them to our program. It's after school. He lives in McCullough Homes. So he's right in the trenches with the guns and the drugs. And you know about McCullough Homes, the average salary is about $13,000, right? And nobody can live on that. He got a bunch of brothers and sisters, but his parents love him, and they love how we handle him, if you hear that. So we just had 47 graduates. If you go on our page, you'll see it. No media. We invited them out, and we don't normally do that. But nobody came to watch 47 young black men in an after-school program, not on a weekend, after school. And the reason why they keep coming, yeah, we pick them up, but they love how we treat them. So it's to answer brother point, to brother question or what he brilliantly said, and Doc as well. If you make your program attractive, right? And attractive only means that he know I love him. He know I care about him. I help him. He know I don't tolerate foolishness. He understand discipline and structure. He understand that I'm gonna reward him, but he also understands there's gonna be consequences with the reward if he don't perform well. But they just represent love. So what do we tell the young brothers while we doing this program? What do we tell you?
Say it one more time.
What do we, yeah, that's okay. What did we tell y'all why y'all in our program? What did we tell y'all?
They tell us because they love us.
Is it true?
Yes.
How you know it's true?
I know it's true because they show us love and they explain to us what they did and they explain to us don't do that what they did. They show us this, they reward us and all that. They show us that they love us in the program.
So 44 weeks straight. 44 weeks. So and I could be up here all day talking about this, but I just want to give a big shout out to y'all, bro, because y'all really we don't have a lot of time to be playing, but I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
We probably only actually have time for one more question because we didn't know we don't. So let's do two. Let's do the sister yellow and then we'll come over here. In fact, you'll ask your question and then you pass it, do them all together. No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I would just like to say this is fabulous. One thing I heard I disagree with is that being called a nigger is equal to an LGBTQ person. I disagree with that wholly. I just wanted to add that. But I wanted to also say, I wanted to know, do you go outside? Is it just Baltimore? I'm from DC, but I love a lot of the programs that are going on in Baltimore. And I wanted to come over today, but I wanted to know, I know I don't have to be a Baltimore because I called and given that information, but would you be expanding ideas or is it just the work you're going to be doing concentrated in Baltimore only?
You mind taking them over?
I think since we're talking about violence in Baltimore and the public health approach, nonprofit industrial complex, the obvious question is, take up safe streets. Or not safe, my mistake, not safe streets, ceasefire. You talked about safe streets, but ceasefire. That's a movement that's completely organic to Baltimore. It's led and founded by Black people. And it mentioned, I'm very surprised. It seems like an obvious question in this discussion.
I'll take the ceasefire question real quick.
Right.
So when you say ceasefire, I was going to ask you which one, because there are two different ones that reflect two different approaches. So the ceasefire model, it centers around, it's a traditional sort of law enforcement involved, but seen as like more open, focused. That basically, if you've seen them, actually it was kind of in The Wire. They had this thing called the call-in, where they take people who are known to be street involved.
She's not talking.
I know, I'm just saying. So there's this thing called ceasefire, the call-in traditional ceasefire model that says, look, we know you're street involved. We have services for you. And they might bring in a pastor or someone like that. But if you don't leave the game, put your guns down, we're going to bring the full force of the police down upon you. And just given the relationship that we just saw here, the need to actually understand people's trauma and systemic oppression, that is just so much the opposite of what is needed. That model has failed in Baltimore many times. But it does get mentioned as an evidence-based best practice because it's worked elsewhere. I mean, those places are not slave cities, right? Baltimore ceasefire is a movement, not to be confused with the other ceasefire, which is why I brought it up, which will have talked about changing communal norms, but from a bottom-up, more grassroots, holistic perspective. So this whole communal norms thing, it obviously can be true that violence is normalized, but if you view it from a public health model, the violent community norm can be seen as the community itself replicating the disease of violence. While Baltimore ceasefire is trying to take that bottom-up approach to say that we organically can reframe our relationship to these conditions, but not ignore the systemic oppression and the trauma that produced those conditions. So we obviously know a lot of the folks in the movement, we support them. I just wanted to bring that previous example up first because it's a confusing term. There are two different things called ceasefire. And I just have an example of how the public health movement can actually co-opt what is an obviously true thing. And we don't need them. Without them, even though I know some people with Baltimore C5 might use the word public health, when the top-down institutions come in, that's when the co-option becomes possible.
And so to your question, they're mentioned in the report. So I mentioned the things that I mentioned because I've noticed we are here and then part of the rites of passage, but they're included in that fourth section that I mentioned. That they're certainly included in that. And to your question, our work primarily is in Baltimore City. We have partners in other places. We don't see ourselves as like trying to do a franchise and like have LBS, you know what I mean? But we have partners in other people who we work with. So I know in DC there's like the Pan-African Community Action organization. There are different formations of like, Black Lives Matter. There are a variety of other folks that we partner with that are in DC. So I would encourage you, and we'll give some thought to the partners that are in the region and get that information to you. All right, thank you all for coming out. We will. We don't have them yet, but we'll make sure if you're not signed up on the email distribution list, please do. And let me just make one last pitch. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not a nonprofit, we're an LLC. The majority of our resources doesn't come from philanthropy. A large chunk of it comes from supporting our organization by being sustainers. lbsbaltimore.com. That allows you to become a sustainer of our organization. That helps. We're at about 500 people that give us monthly, and we're trying to expand that so we can do even more. And then the last thing I'll say, if you can't contribute financially, join our email listserv. It allows our political advocacy to be effective. We send out action alerts, people contacting their legislature or the public officials who we're targeting. That's been extremely helpful. So again, if you can't contribute financially, please go and join our list and do that. Rachel, do you want to say something about the museum? Say something close. Okay.
But these are the type of things that this museum is here for. It's not just a museum where you can learn about history and see pictures and glorious art. If you didn't get a chance, come back anytime and check out this exhibition. This is our Young People at Work. This is the art show, Black People, Black Magic. And on the second floor is African Manifesto, which was curated by Zola and Robert Dayvon. It was 7 African American women to be asked to curate an exhibition for the display in alleys. But yeah, it's dope stuff, and I look forward to what we do.
All right, thank you. All right, safe travels.